Welcome to The Explainer. So, have you ever held your Bible and just wondered, is this really what they wrote thousands of years ago? Well, today we're launching a full-blown forensic investigation into the very words on the page. We're going to follow the clues, look at the hard evidence, and solve the mystery of how we got the Bible we have today. And you'll see why the translation you choose, well, it matters a whole lot more than you might think. And right away, we hit our central mystery. The original documents written by Matthew, Paul, John, they're gone. They've vanished into history. So that leaves us with a huge question, right? How can we possibly know what the authors actually wrote? It seems like an impossible problem, but the truth is, the evidence to solve it has been there all along, just waiting for us to piece it together. Okay, let's lay out our investigative roadmap. First, we're going to tackle the case of the missing originals. Then, we'll examine the actual manuscript evidence, our key witnesses. We'll look at two competing texts that are at the center of this whole debate, and then we'll figure out what matters more, older manuscripts or more manuscripts. After that, we dive into some forensic case studies, the real smoking gun evidence, and finally we'll deliver the final verdict. Let's get started. So, every good detective story starts at the scene of the crime, but in this case, the scene is empty. The original documents, what scholars called the autographs, the actual parchments the biblical authors wrote on, they don't exist anymore. They're gone. And we have to start by accepting that fact, because it forces us to rely on the only thing we have left, copies. Think about it. For centuries before the printing press was even a dream, the only way to duplicate a book was for a scribe to sit down and copy it by hand, word for word, page for page. It was an incredibly slow and difficult process. And, these scribes were human. A tired eye, a moment of distraction, or even a scribe trying to be helpful by clarifying a passage could introduce a change. And that change could then get copied into the next version, and the next, and so on. So with thousands of these handwritten copies, all with slight differences, how in the world do we sort through them to figure out what the original said? Well, that's where this tool called textual criticism comes in. And don't let the name scare you. It's basically the forensic science for ancient documents. It's a set of logical rules and principles that scholars use to compare all the manuscript evidence and reconstruct with a very high degree of certainty what the original text most likely said. Okay, so we've got our forensic toolkit. Now it's time to meet our key witnesses, the ancient manuscripts themselves. Each one of these is like a snapshot in time, a voice from the past that has a piece of the story to tell. So let's profile these witnesses and see what they reveal. The physical evidence itself is amazing. Our earliest witnesses are written on papyrus, which is basically an ancient paper made from reeds. It's super fragile, so it mostly survived in the dry climate of Egypt. But these fragments are our closest link to the originals. Later on, they switched to parchment, durable, treated animal skin, and began binding them into books called codices, the book format we still use today. Christians loved the codex because it was way easier to flip through than a scroll to find a specific passage. So, as scholars collected and compared thousands of these manuscripts from all over the ancient world, a pattern started to emerge. The evidence began to point to two main families of texts, two textual traditions that became the primary suspects in our investigation. And almost every Bible translation you can buy today is based on one of these two competing texts. This is where it gets really good. All right, let's put our two suspects side by side. On one side, you have the Textus Receptus, or the received text. This is the Greek text that the King James Version is based on. It was first printed in 1515 and was based on just a handful of manuscripts that were available at the time, mostly from the 10th to 12th centuries. On the other side, you have what's called the critical text. This isn't one single book, but a scholarly consensus text that's constantly being refined as we find more evidence. It's based on all the evidence we have, thousands of manuscripts, but it gives the most weight to our oldest and best copies, which date all the way back to the 2nd to 4th centuries. And that brings us right to the core principle of our whole investigation. What's more important, the age of the evidence or the amount of it? I mean, think about it like a rumor. Would you trust a story you hear from 1,000 people a week after an event, or the story you hear from 2 eyewitnesses right after it happened? This is the fundamental question. Do we trust the older manuscripts or just the ones that have more copies? Just look at this timeline. It really puts it all into perspective. The original New Testament books were written in the 1st century. The key witnesses for the critical text, like the early papyri and amazing manuscripts like Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, are from the 2nd to 4th centuries. That's really close to the originals. Now look at the primary manuscripts used for the Textus Receptus, the KJV's base. They're from the 12th century. That's a gap of over 1,000 years. 1,000 years of scribes copying copies of copies. That chronological gap is a massive, massive problem. So, to stay objective, these textual detectives follow a few basic rules of evidence. Rule number 1, prefer the oldest reading. It just makes sense, right? It's had less time to be changed. Rule 2, prefer the harder reading. Scribes were human, and if they came across something confusing or grammatically awkward, their instinct was to smooth it out or fix it. They almost never made a text more difficult. And rule 3, prefer the shorter reading. Scribes were far more likely to add a little note, a clarification, or a pious comment than they were to just randomly delete a chunk of text. And what's fascinating is that these common sense rules almost always point back to the readings found in those older critical text manuscripts. Okay, now for the climax of our investigation. We've laid the groundwork, we've profiled the suspects. Now we're going to look at the smoking gun evidence. These are specific, undeniable examples that are frankly fatal to the idea that the Textus Receptus is the best version of the New Testament. So let's open the case files. First up, Exhibit A. And this one is a bombshell. This is not a debatable point or a matter of opinion. This is a confirmed, historically documented error that was introduced into the Textus Receptus by a man trying to meet a deadline. This alone should give anyone who thinks the KJV's text is perfect some serious pause. Okay, here's the story. In 1516, a scholar named Erasmus was rushing to publish the very first printed Greek New Testament. The problem was, the one Greek manuscript of Revelation he had was missing the last 6 verses. So what did he do? Instead of waiting, he took a Latin Bible, the Latin Vulgate, and translated those last 6 verses from Latin back into Greek to finish his book. The problem? The Latin copy he used had a known error, changing Tree of Life to Book of Life. And that mistake, a translation from Latin, not from an original Greek manuscript, got cemented into the Textus Receptus and then printed in the King James Version. Every single known Greek manuscript of Revelation says Tree of Life. It's an open and shut case of human error. Okay, on to Exhibit B. This might be the most famous addition in the entire KJV. It's a verse in 1 John known as the Comma Johanneum. It's a crystal clear, powerful statement on the doctrine of the Trinity. There's just one tiny problem. It wasn't actually in the original book of 1 John. So where did it come from? The forensic evidence here is absolutely overwhelming. This verse is absent from literally all early Greek manuscripts. It doesn't appear until very late. We know exactly how it got into the Bible. It started as a handwritten note jotted down in the margin of some Latin copies. Erasmus, the same guy from before, knew it wasn't original, so he left it out of his first 2 editions of the Greek New Testament. But he came under intense political and religious pressure, so he reluctantly added it to his 3rd edition, and from there it made its way into the KJV. This is a proven, theological addition made centuries after the fact. Now, you might hear some people argue that the KJV is based on the majority text, the idea that we should just count up all the manuscripts and go with the reading that appears most often. Well, that argument has a huge problem. It's factually wrong. The Textus Receptus, the text the KJV is based on, actually differs from the so-called majority text in 1,838 places. So the KJV isn't even a good representative of the majority of late manuscripts. It's based on a few of them that just happened to be available to Erasmus in the 16th century. And the list goes on and on. Take the famous longer ending of Mark's Gospel. Our 2 oldest and best manuscripts, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, both end the book at verse 8. The extra 12 verses were clearly added later. Or the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. It's a beautiful story, but it's not in our earliest witnesses, and it moves around to different places in other manuscripts, which is a sure sign it was a beloved story that a scribe later inserted into the text. These aren't minor changes. These are entire stories and sections that the manuscript evidence shows were not part of the original writings. So, we've reviewed the evidence. We've interrogated the key witnesses. We've examined the smoking guns. It's time to step back and deliver the final verdict. Where does all of this evidence lead us? The verdict is just clear. The critical text, which is the basis for virtually all modern translations like the NIV, ESV, or NASB, is overwhelmingly superior. Its witnesses are 1,000 years older. They come from a scribal tradition, the Alexandrian, that was known for being incredibly careful and conservative. And its methodology is sound. It's based on a rigorous evaluation of all 5,800 plus manuscripts we have, not just a few late ones that happen to be in the right place at the right time. When you look at the facts, the case is closed. The textual base of the King James Version, the Textus Receptus, is factually untenable. It's built on a foundation of a few late manuscripts. It contains a confirmed documented error translated from Latin. It includes clear theological additions that were not in the original Greek. And it keeps later expansions, like the ending of Mark, that our best evidence tells us weren't there in the beginning. The argument for its superiority completely collapses under the weight of the evidence. And this is the most important takeaway from this whole investigation. The next time you hear someone say that modern translations are changing the Bible or removing verses, you'll know the truth. They aren't changing it, they are restoring it. They're getting us closer to what the biblical authors actually wrote by using much, much older and better evidence that simply wasn't available 400 years ago. This work actually gives us more confidence in the Bible, not less. So we'll leave you with this final question. Now that you've seen the evidence for yourself, the timeline, the detective's rules, the smoking guns, which text do you think gets us closer to the original words of Scripture? The choice and the confidence that comes with it is yours.